to the Investor Coaching Show. Here's your host, Paul Winkler.
Joined this hour by Mr. Chad Henson. Let's see. Certified financial planner. Chartered
Special needs consultant.
special needs consultant. I was like, I'm going to blow it.
And chartered retirement planning counselor.
Yeah, whatever. Okay. Getting piled higher and deeper as we speak. So anyway, Chad, I thought I would do for an hour. I had a conversation with a young lady, and I'm eternally interested in how you guys view the job of the financial planner and kind of philosophical differences that we have. Now, dealing with special needs children, you're dealing with children that have, maybe that they're, I wasn't going to go here, but I think I will go here. Why not? So you're dealing with kids that maybe have physical disabilities, possibly mental disabilities,
Right.
and you're dealing with kids that are maybe not going to be able to necessarily take care of themselves fully as they get older, and their parents are worried what happens to these kids as
Sure.
they get older.
Yeah, that's a big worry for parents.
So talk a little bit about that.
I mean, you just think of normal parents, they worry about their typical kids, being able to survive life without them. And but when you're dealing with, parents that have children with special needs, it's even more incumbent to be, educated, number one, and then, preparing for the future, because, none of us live forever. And there's a high likelihood, unless there is, some other type of underlying illness, that the child will outlive the parents.
I had a situation a couple weeks ago, something like that. All days run together for me. But the situation was where it was a parent, and what they had done is they decided that they were going, and they said it was a fun experiment. I thought that was the interesting thing about the conversation. It was a fun experiment. What they did is they had several children. Not necessarily disabled, but they did have varying levels of responsibility.
Right.
I'm just like, how do I nicely put this?
Right.
That works for me. That works okay right there. That differing levels of views of responsibility. And what they did was they decided to do a test on giving them money and giving them certain amounts of money. It reminded me of the prodigal child that decided, but he's getting it all. The prodigal
Right,
child
yeah.
gets it all, right? And really screws it up. And then, comes crawling back and saying, oh my goodness, I don't even deserve to get, what the servants get. But is that anything you guys covered at all in the studies that where you wanted to see? Because sometimes you have somebody with a kid with a disability, but maybe that they actually parents think that they're more disabled than they actually are.
Yeah, I think that's fairly common in the sense that parents are, even parents of typical children are very protective. And,
Mm-hmm.
It's just a nurturing thing you have, that you always want to protect your kids.
And the difference between protecting and enabling can be a fine line.
It's a very fine line, yeah. But also in the sense of being so protective, a lot of times parents, whether the child's disabled or not, don't let the child reach their fulfillment.
And I think that's a really good point. So, and my thinking in regards to that is sometimes what a parent ought to think about is, do we just give the child certain amounts of line to hang themselves, so to speak, in a way where they just get them out there and say, make some decisions and let's see how they do. Because while they're around, it's a lot better to make some of those mistakes and maybe give them some leeway while they're still around to pick up the pieces later on, versus later on and just hope that they're going to be able to handle things when they're not around anymore. Absolutely.
It's a great idea. Like I said, whether it's a typical child or a child with special needs, I mean, that's part of the growing and learning process. And even more so, if you have a child with special needs, it's kind of a depth gauge per se, of what, your child can and cannot handle, and how that needs to be portrayed, either to future caretakers, siblings, trustees of trust, maybe even the language that you write into trust, because if they're able to handle more than what you thought they would be able to handle, maybe the trust language can be a little more lenient. If they're not able to handle as much as you thought they could, then maybe you need to be a little more strict in the language of how funds would be distributed. So
when, let's say that you're trying to decide who's going to be the trustee, of a trust for a special needs. Now explain, let's step back a second and explain what a special needs trust is and what they basically do for the child that has special needs. How do they work?
Yeah. So they're different types, but the most commonly thought of is what we call a third-party special needs trust. And that is where it's not an asset of the child. The assets belong to the trust, but they're for the benefit of the child. And so they're set up, and the reason,
I was going to say the reason, there's going to be a definite reason for it not to be the child's asset. So yeah, definitely get into that.
Exactly. They're set up so that a child with special needs or an adult child with special needs is still able to qualify for benefits and assistance from whether it be government or programs or things of that nature. Unfortunately, our system, hasn't grown with times. You talk all the time about inflation. How in the 70s the average wage was $7,000, and today it's $60,000.
It just shocks people to hear that.
Yeah, to qualify for a lot of the government funds, such as supplemental security income, you can't have assets over $2,000 currently. There have been numerous bills.
Yeah, that's been that way for as long as I remember. Yeah.
There was a bill last year that was basically tabled, but it was to raise the threshold to $10,000, which still is very low, but it's much better than $2,000.
Well, it's like the death benefit for Social Security, $255. Been that way since the 1930s or something like that.
Yeah, well, in the 1930s, you might have been able to buy enough wood to build a coffin, but today that won't even buy you, scrap wood.
That is so true. It's so funny. You go, why is it that, right? Why is it that number? That makes no sense to me.
Yeah, but
so what in general? What are some of the benefits that might be? That somebody might be eligible that you're talking about? You said SSDI.
So you got SSI, which is supplemental security income, where if you have, little to no income, it's an additional benefit provided by the government. It's actually adjusted for inflation each year. But the monthly benefit's not enough to live on by itself.
So how do you qualify for such a thing? Because I brought up SSDI, but you're talking about a different program there.
So basically it's an income dependent program. You can't have currently over $2,000 in assets in your name, and your income has to be below a certain level. You have an $80 exclusion.
It's like super low. I remember it was less than 10,000, wasn't it, or something like that?
Oh, your income, yes, for a year, yes, but it's done on a monthly basis.
Right. Okay, yeah, I don't know the monthly number, but I remember that I was like 800. I can't. It's been too long since I studied it.
Yeah, right now the full, if you got the full benefit, I think it's in the upper 800 range.
Okay, that sounds right to me based on my memory of it. But anyway, so that is, and so you can benefit from that, and then if you work, then that benefit gets taken away, because I've seen people under that benefit.
Right. If you make over a certain amount of income, you have an exclusion. There's a $20 and then a $60, which totals an $80 a month exclusion. And then it's basically 50 cents on every dollar that you earn gets taken away. The other part of it is, though, if you have extra expenses, you can deduct those if they are pertinent, a disability expense that you have to perform the job, whether it be some type of special equipment or, even ride shares and things of that nature. You can deduct that from your wages to help keep you under that threshold.
Okay, so that's one benefit that might be available to somebody. in regards to, let's say, a special needs child. Is there anything else that I'd be thinking about besides that?
The biggest benefit and the most important for families to hold on to is the medical benefits that are provided. In Tennessee, it's called TennCare, but it's basically Medicaid. Every state has their own program. So, and then there are also, depending on the state you live in, whether there are federal grants and things that you can put on, be on waiting lists for and everything. But every state has programs as well, and it's state dependent on where you live. Some states are much better than others as far as things that you can get, but you have low income housing, which is referred to as Section 8. A lot of people think it's just, the poverty, but there are low income housing, for people with disabilities. There are group homes for people with disabilities, but,
Group homes. Tell me a little bit about that.
So like a lot of group homes, and church that I went to several years ago, they were some of the members of the church worked for an organization, and they had group homes, and it was for adults with disabilities. And a lot of times you'll find them where they may be, similar. Maybe you have intellectual disabilities in, a group home, and they'll be usually in smaller sizes, like maybe 4 to 6 people that live in the same home. And depending on what their abilities are, there are all different levels of group homes. Some of them are completely independent. Some of them have maybe, what did you call it when we were in college and you had the
a dorm
person that,
an
dorm
RA?
mother or dorm
RA?
Father. Yeah. RA, someone
assistant?
that, just kind of helps with them with certain things. The group that attended the church that I went to, one was blind. Well, both of them were blind actually. And they had a caretaker that lived in the home with them that helped, cook meals and assist them with things. And they went to the store, but they also had jobs. The organization provided jobs for disabilities too. So they actually went to work and, had some sense of normalcy, in life.
So the reason to do a special needs trust, as we're talking about, is just, when you're working with an attorney doing this, that's who would draft such a document for you. But the idea is that leave the asset separate from the child so that it is not necessarily an asset of the child, which would end up causing them to lose those other benefits that we're referring to.
Yeah. And there are restrictions on how those, the money in the trust can be used so that you stay, qualified for the benefits that you're receiving. But it's general thought, it's to supplement the lifestyle, not supplant the lifestyle.
Right. So as to not put the child in a position, or the adult child, as it were, in the position of just living in absolute dire poverty. And just because I think so often, you look at that and go, oh my goodness, to live at that particular level, I can't even imagine my kid.
If you were totally dependent on SSI and your insurance from the government, and that's all you had, you couldn't live. There's nowhere that you could rent and have a place and be able to eat, and it's just not possible.
Right. So when you're doing, let's say if somebody like yourself was doing special needs planning, what is your role in working with these families? What are the types of things that you do? How do you approach it?
Yeah. So basically what, I do, the first thing is just education, and it's trying to, assess the situation, from, I'm an outsider, obviously, to it. So I can look at things more objectively than maybe the parents can and everything. And just to go through the education of planning, because you're planning not only for your retirement, but you're planning for your child who likely will outlive you. And there's so many variables, and degrees or levels of disability. A lot of adults with disabilities, can live a fairly normal lifestyle where others, require constant care. So, there's no one size fits all for everything. And you just kind of have to assess what the situation is and what the needs are going to be in the future.
Well, I think one thing that comes to mind for me is when you're dealing with, sometimes people will Oh, it's kind of like the old bumper sticker. I'm spending my grandkids
Right.
and kids' inheritance and so on and so forth. And now you're really thinking in terms of when I take an income from my investment portfolio, not running the portfolio down. Like I see people do this thing where they say, hey, you can do this annuity and you'll get this level of distribution. But, when you do that, if you annuitize, then the money's gone at your death, and you're staying away from that even more so than normal.
Absolutely.
Like the plague when you're dealing with that
yeah.
particular situation, because you got to make sure that the money lasts, number one, for the next generation. And then the other thing that, I think about, okay, so I take this money, now I've got to think about the IRA distribution rules and the inherited IRA distribution rules. But you have an exception for disabilities.
Yeah.
And talk a little bit about that for inherited IRAs. Now, you have the 10-year rule. If you are not a spouse of the person that owns the IRA, if you are a spouse, you can take over the IRA as your own. If you're not a spouse, you have 10 years. In most cases, there are some limited exceptions that all of the money has to be distributed from the IRA and taxes paid on it. But what is the rule for in this particular situation? You got somebody that's a disability.
Yeah, so if you have an adult child or a child that's a minor with disabilities, the minor obviously has, additional sets of rules to it. But as an adult child with disabilities, you inherit an IRA, you can stretch it over your life expectancy, which falls under the same as the old rule was prior to, 2020, I think it was.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And so it can be distributed over that period of time. You still have to be cautious about, you don't want to leave it to the child as a beneficiary if they're going to be dependent on, some type of government assistance. And it varies with, every different adult, because there are a lot
and some
of
people may even just say, I don't want my kid dependent on government assistance because
Exactly.
I do have means of my own.
Right.
Now, that's a really important rule in this particular case. So what that basic rule says is this. There's a person, they look at your life expectancy. And life expectancy for the beneficiary depends on what age they are when they inherit the IRA. So let's say that they're age 40, let's just use when the person passes away, the parent passes away, and the child is age 40. And let's say that they look at that child and they go, okay, you've got let's say 45-year life expectancy. I don't know. I'm probably not far off. Let's say it's a 45-year life expectancy, because, it's not what the life expectancy that you had when you were born, which may be age 78. You've made it through 40 years of stuff. And when you're age 40, you're going to have a longer life expectancy than another 38 years, 40 plus 38, 78, which was originally when you were born. So what happens is this. Let's say it's 45 years. They'll go like this. They'll say, here's the account balance. You have to take out account balance divided by life expectancy 45, and then that will be your distribution amount. So, when you first begin, it can be fairly low. Let's say if it's 40, and then we go 2.5% of the account value. Then next year it's going to be 39 years. Then it's going to be 38 years. They're going to subtract 1 year for every year as you get older. It's not like the life expectancy for required minimum distributions. It's a little bit different. But that is a far cry better, because typically if you're looking at a well-managed investment portfolio, the distribution amount is typically going to be significantly greater than that you can take. So you may have an account that ends up growing and you're only taking out well more than the growth rate in much more advanced years. So that is important. That's a really important rule when it comes down to that. Now, it used to be the case for people inheriting regular IRAs. It just isn't anymore. So we're talking about, you've got a child maybe that they have a mental disability, a physical disability, worried about what happens to them if you can't be around anymore. But you also have kids that are, let's say, they just make bad decisions. A lot of times you'll get kids that, for one reason or another, make decisions on like overspending. I think of overspending just because simply what happens so often, what we do, and it's a lot of people do it too. It doesn't, don't even have to be a special needs kid to do this. You can be a normal human and do this. Trying to get approval. And, approval from parents, showing not just parents, but also just regular people that you've grown up with, just to show that maybe you were picked on and you want to show, hey, I want to show that I'm actually competent, I'm good, and I've made it. I was talking to somebody the other day and I said, it's like when I was a kid, Chad, I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, if you didn't have Converse sneakers, you were not cool.
Yeah, I remember.
Was it Converse for you guys too?
It was Converse for us too. Yeah. I'm not that far behind you.
Oh man, I remember it was like, oh goodness, and there were certain Levi's. You had to have the Levi's with a certain tag in it, and
right.
if you didn't make it, you had to have a certain kind of bike. You had to, there's all of these things. So
and I had none of those.
Well, I didn't either. It's traumatized me for life.
Yeah, I know. I think I had, what was it? Sears used to sell the tough skins that had the reinforced knee because I was always tearing them. You sit down and it's like a flat spot that stuck out on your knee.
Yeah, or no-name sneakers.
Oh, yeah.
So what happens is we not, and it's, I like to explain that our mind is like this mansion and the conscious part of our mind's a little broom closet. And so much of what we do is subconscious. So we may spend into oblivion just to show that we're worthy. We're really, we've made it and that we're important. And it's so funny because we're using money in a way to connect with people, but we're connecting by trying to, and this is the American way, impress people with money that we don't have. We try to impress people because we don't feel, worthy of their attention otherwise. And so what happens is people want to feel okay and they will spend money because that's how they connect. And the reality of it is that's not, typically people are jealous of you when you've got more than they do. It's really the opposite. That's the funny thing about it is it's really the opposite. So what happens is you may have a child that every time money comes into their hands, they blow it because of this phenomenon. And therefore, that if I give them money, I mean, think of the prodigal child. That's a perfect example of that.
Oh, yeah.
That's exactly what was going on there. Goes out and blows it all on wine, women, and song or whatever. And then comes back, realizing, oh, none of that stuff made me as happy as I thought it was going to make me. Matter of fact, I'm miserable. Mm-hmm. But it's often too late. So this is why sometimes people will do trial inheritances. They'll give kids a certain amount of money, $10,000 each kid. I've seen that.
I have too. Yeah.
Yeah. So what kind of things have you seen where they just go and give it, and then they say, "Here, give it a shot." Let's see.
It's I wouldn't say every client does it, but I have seen a few clients of ours that do that, and they won't admit that that's what they're doing. Mm-hmm. But it really is, in a sense, kind of a trial to see how the child will handle, a big inflow of unexpected money, whether or not they will be rational and responsible with it, or if it's woohoo, let's go to Vegas.
Right. So that is why they're looking for that. They're looking at there's differences in the way they handle it. So then they can decide, is there something we need to do trust-wise? Now, when we deal with trusts, one of the things that you look at is, do we have a corporate trustee? Do we have an individual trustee? What are your typical thoughts regarding corporate versus individual trustees?
So I'm a big fan of, if you can possibly have an individual trustee, someone who's familiar with the family or the situation. Corporate trustees can be expensive, and they're
impersonal.
Yeah, impersonal. They're cold, because they are a corporate. They don't know the family or anything. You can also make the case for, though, that, if you have, let's say you're a parent and you have, 2 children, and one child's very responsible, the other child's not responsible, and you leave money outright to one and in a trust for the other, you can create friction, especially if the other is the trustee.
That is so true. I was just going to say it. If you didn't say it, I was going to say it. Yeah, that can be. And sometimes they don't want that job for the life of them.
Yeah, and I work with the client, and that's the situation. And the one beneficiary that their money is in a trust, I try to explain to them that it's not your sibling's fault. Your sibling only can follow what's written in the trust. If you want to be mad at somebody, Be mad at your parents, not your sibling, because they didn't have any control over it.
But not for long, because your parents left you something.